All right, we're continuing with 1 Peter. We gave you outlines yesterday. And I'd like to just comment a little bit here on the relationship of 1 Peter to other books of Scripture. If we compare 1 and 2 Peter for a moment, First Peter stresses the suffering that Christians are going to experience. Suffering is an issue that we have to deal with. 2 Peter stresses other issues that confront believers in the last days. The issue of personal growth, fidelity to the truth, and godliness. Suffering is not an emphasis in 2 Peter. Suffering is only an emphasis of 1 Peter. And the real challenge in 2 Peter is spiritual growth and faithfulness. Since the theme of 1 Peter, one of the primary themes of 1 Peter is suffering, there's an automatic parallel to the book of James, which deals a good amount with suffering, and also with 2 Timothy, which talks about Paul's sufferings and Timothy's expectation of suffering. And if in fact Peter wrote a little bit earlier than Paul, then the sufferings that Peter predicted here in this book are probably well illustrated by the sufferings of Paul in his prison epistles. Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians, and his letters to Timothy. I would like to contrast Peter to Paul in terms of eschatology. I think it's very important to notice a subtle difference between these two apostles. Paul's eschatology in Romans and 1 and 2 Thessalonians and 2 Timothy is much more explicit than Peter's eschatology in these two books. Paul distinguishes clearly between rapture and revelation. Peter makes almost no distinction at all. I was noticing this with Scott a couple of weeks ago in our AKX program. And we were looking at 1 Peter chapter. We were evaluating passages that the Awana material had actually listed as rapture passages, and the fellow that wrote up the Awana manual for the AKX says that Matthew 24 and 25, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, and the references in Peter are all rapture passages. And I took exception to that because I don't believe they are. However, I've always been a little up in the air about Peter's eschatology. Look at 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 through 9. And also verse 13. In this ye greatly rejoice, though now for a season, if need be, ye are in heaviness through manifold trials, that the trial of your faith, being much more precious than of gold that perishes, though it be tried with fire, might be found unto praise and honor and glorying at, literally, the revelation of Jesus Christ, whom having not seen ye love, in whom though now ye see him not, yet believing ye rejoice with joy unspeakable and full of glory, receiving the end of your faith, even the salvation of your souls. Verse 13. Wherefore, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and hope to the end for the grace that is to be brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, you will find that people like Walvoord and Ryrie and Phillips, most premillennial writers, will make a distinction between the rapture and the revelation. The term revelation means what? You're in Revelation this year, aren't you? What are you in, Matthew? Oh, so yeah. Okay, what does apocalypsis mean? It means to unveil, uncover. That's what it means. It means an unveiling, an uncovering. The word itself means that. Do you think that the rapture will have any sense of unveiling or uncovering will be there at the rapture? I believe so. I think that the rapture, even though its primary connotation is a catching up of believers to be with the Lord in the air, don't you think that at that moment a lot of things that were previously hidden to our minds and hearts will become clear? Don't you think we'll see Him, we'll understand Him? There's going to be increased knowledge. For us as believers, the rapture will be a revelation, will it not? What is different about the rapture revelation and the revelation, the second advent? Not only time, but in terms of the revelation itself. Pardon? Yes. And who is that? The whole world is going to see. You understand? Like in Revelation chapter 1 verse 7, it says that the nations of the earth will mourn when they see Christ coming out of heaven in power and great glory. You understand? Like the great revelation of the second advent is where everybody sees and understands what's happening. Right? So that's properly, like Van Impe. I first sort of got this point from Van Impe. For a long time, it didn't cross my mind that the second advent was really basically a revelation. And I've heard people, I think it was him that said that the rapture is never called a revelation. The revelation is reserved for the second advent, when the whole world, the reality of the invisible government of a sovereign God in the world is unveiled at the second advent. That's a great revelation the whole earth sees and mourns. Are you with me? But I believe that it's quite possible that 1 Peter, in chapter 1 here, uses the word revelation to describe the rapture. Who is he writing to? Is he not writing to believers? Just like Paul is writing to believers? Is he not suggesting that when we see the Lord, that we're going to receive the end of our faith? The hidden things, the mysteries of our faith are going to be revealed to us as believers. It'll be uncovered for us. We're going to see the Lord face to face as He is. We're going to actually recognize the manifold grace of God when we see the Lord. Now, I suggest that to you because I've never heard anybody preach it, and I'm not being dogmatic. I am suggesting that perhaps Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 1, in these two verses, in verses 7 and 13, uses the word apocalypsis to refer to the rapture. Because it will be an unveiling for believers, but not for the whole world, just for us. You understand? Our minds will be brought to light. I say that because Peter's eschatology is otherwise quite vague. For example, in chapter 5, verse 4, he says, "When the chief shepherd shall appear, ye shall receive a crown of glory that fadeth not away." That still sounds like rapture to me. He's talking to Christians, being rewarded, right? When the chief shepherd shall appear, when Christ comes back. And yet, when we come to 2 Peter, he talks about the day of the Lord in chapter 3, coming as a thief in the night. He uses the same terminology, thief in the night, that Paul uses in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Doesn't he? He's talking about the day of the Lord, great judgment on the world. And he calls it says it's going to come as a thief in the night, but he doesn't describe that as this. Do you think 2 Peter 3:10 is describing the second advent? Look at it. What do you think that's describing? What? Revelation what? The final judgment. Like nothing else happens after this one. I mean, the whole earth melts. Are we talking about the second advent judgments of the nations here? The purging of Israel? Are we talking about resurrection of the dead for judgment here? I think we're talking about Armageddon, period. See? Not tribulation Armageddon, but the end of the age when the old world and the old heavens are passed away and the new heavens and new earth are created. But Peter uses the same terminology as Paul does in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 to refer to the second advent. You see that? I'm not sure I'm getting through. I really don't.
It's two editions. You got one and you got the other.
First Thessalonians chapter 5. When they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction shall come upon them. The day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night. He uses identical terminology, but he's talking about something different. So, we're talking about the relationship of Peter to Paul in terms of eschatology, and I believe that Peter uses terms very differently than Paul does in terms of eschatology. Okay? He uses revelation to refer to the rapture, I believe, and he uses the day of the Lord to refer to the final destruction of heaven and earth instead of the second advent, like Paul uses it. Peter's use of revelation, the term revelation, is not like John's use of the term revelation in the last book of the Bible. I just leave that for your evaluation. Herbert Lockyer compares Peter to three other Bible writers. Kind of a quotable quote here. He says that Peter is thus before us as the apostle of hope, as Paul is before us as the apostle of faith, as John is before us as the apostle of love, and as James is the apostle of action. So Peter stresses hope, Paul stresses faith, John stresses love, James stresses action. That's probably a valid quotation. Now we're finished with our official notes on 1 Peter. I just want to start working our way through the book. We have today and tomorrow to do this. I want to raise another issue for you that comes up at the beginning of 1 Peter in the interpretation here. Okay? One big issue is eschatology. Peter's eschatology seems to be fundamentally different than Paul. I don't think it really is. He redefines his terms in his own way. So you have to take Peter's context to define Peter's terms. Okay? This really relates to hermeneutics. Okay, you can't just take the one word like Revelation and run all the scriptures on it and assume that it means the same thing in every passage. Each writer may define it his own way. Important point. I believe that Peter teaches eternal security, but it's hard to see it. Okay? In fact, there are some very much debated passages of Scripture in Peter's letters on the subject of eternal security. What is the doctrine of eternal security? Once saved, always saved. In other words, a believer cannot lose his or her salvation. Take a moment and read 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 to 5. And tell me, what do you think Peter is teaching on this doctrine? Do you think he holds to eternal security or not? And defend it. What about this passage argues for eternal security? Let's get real specific. Okay, verse 4. The inheritance is reserved.
God's.
Okay, the fact that it's a sovereignly instituted plan. Begotten means what? Birth. Can you reserve the birth process? Can you reverse the birth process? Once born, can you become unborn? So the very fact that he talks about regeneration is, to me, it's almost absurd. Just stop for a moment. For God, if you take into account all these other terms for soteriology that describe what happens to a believer, list some of them. Okay, we're regenerated. What else? Saved. What else? What else? All these other terms. Justified, forgiven, redeemed, propitiate. God doesn't propitiate us. He is propitiated. But we're reconciled. There's 30 or 40 of these terms in the New Testament that describe we're chosen, right? We're predestined, sanctified, imputed. All right, now, if there is no such thing as actual eternal security, that impinges on every single act that God has done in salvation. That means that regeneration can be reversed or nullified. Once born, you can become unborn. Does that fit the natural realm? Of course not. Once you're born, you stay born. All right? So, the fact that he would pick regeneration as a key word here. God has begotten us. Right? Saved. What does saved mean? Basic concept of saved. Delivered. Rescued. Right? Now, is God the kind of God that unrescues people? What's the reverse of rescue? To put a person in danger, in harm's way. Is God the kind of person that does that? Do you ever see a picture of God doing that for a redeemed person in Old or New Testament? You find people saved and bodily killed. There are examples in the book of Hebrews that many righteous people wandered destitute in the caves, but you never find a reference to them spiritually being put in harm's way. That sort of thing. And we could really elaborate on that, but this is something to take into consideration in the doctrine of eternal security that I don't think any of them ever do. Anybody that ever believes in it, these concepts, they've really never integrated the doctrine of loss of salvation to the larger doctrine of soteriology. They couldn't hold to it. Right? Now getting back to 1 Peter chapter 1, the fact that we're regenerated, I don't think that can be reversed. Okay, what else? Okay, living hope. What kind of hope is it if you lose it? That's hopeless. That's
inheritance, the nature of it.
Okay, the nature of the inheritance, the fact that the inheritance is reserved, it's not corruptible. If I can lose my inheritance, then I have gotten something corruptible. Right? So all those terms describe the inheritance. Abundant mercy. Don't overlook that. What is mercy? God not executing justice on a person that deserves justice. Right? It's the obverse side of the coin of grace. Well, grace on one side, mercy on the other. Grace is the positive, mercy is the negative, I believe, logically. Right? So there's abundant mercy. If God has already chosen not to judge us, then what can bring about judgment? I mean, he's already said there is no condemnation. That's mercy.
That's another thing too, if you think about it. If God saved us, we didn't do anything ourselves to merit salvation. So why should we be able to do something to take it away?
Right. Well, that goes back to this. We didn't do anything. Did you do anything to get born? The fact that your birth is totally beyond your ability to bring about, right? Born not of the will of man, nor the will of the flesh, but of God. We're begotten of God. Human will has nothing to do with becoming a Christian. So, yes, exactly. That's the implication.
I think too, people that believe that they can lose their salvation, how do they lose their salvation?
Bad sin. So then the question is, well, how bad?
The thing is, if sin can stop you from being a Christian, then how can anybody become one in the first place?
Right. To me, it's so fraught full of self-defeating contradictions that this lapsarian doctrine, when you lose your salvation, is totally unscriptural. I just want to show you something out of 1 Peter chapter 1, but we haven't exhausted the evidence here for eternal security. Not only is the inheritance reserved, carefully read verses 4 and 5.
Okay.
You who are kept. See that? By the power of God. So the believer is kept by God's power. All right. What else argues for the security of the believer? There's one more thing I think we could say. We're kept by the power of God through faith unto salvation. Notice how the salvation is described. This is salvation that is ready to be revealed. See that? This ultimate deliverance. That he talks about the salvation, even the end of your faith, even the salvation of your souls. God's salvation is in the wings and it's waiting. It's there, it's already committed. God is already committed to this business of salvation. If you're begotten, he's committed. You understand? It's waiting to be revealed. It's not iffy. It's waiting. See? That adds weight to this whole line of argument. Salvation is waiting to be revealed. God has already committed himself to this process. It really fits into Romans chapter 8, verses 28 and 29 and 30, that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. Why can't I not quote it? For whom he did foreknow, them he also predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. For whom he did foreknow, them he also did. Moreover, whom he did predestinate, them he also called. Them he called, them he also justified. And those he justified, he also glorified. Paul seems to picture the person once on the road, once foreknown, once predestinated. Hey, it's guaranteed. He's already got him glorified. See? That's the picture, and that's supported by this argument right here, that the salvation is already waiting. God is committed to the process. Now, there's only one aspect to this whole section that could leave any inkling of support for the loss of salvation view. And what is it? Through faith. We are kept through faith. Well, if it's my faith, man, that's iffy, right? That's the point that they'll point out, right? It's through faith. Well, what if a person stops believing? What if you stop believing? Then what? What you have to do here is look at this passage. What has Peter been saying? What kind of a salvation has he been describing? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. At least 6 major points support eternal security. I mean, there's no quibble about that. If you really understand these concepts, hey, you have a salvation that is secure, right? You are secure. Your inheritance is secure. You're in a position in your relationship to God that you didn't get into by your own choice anyway. All that stuff, right? How can my lack of faith nullify any of that? It doesn't say that it's through my faith. First of all, look at the passage. Does it say it's through my faith? I don't say that it's not, but it doesn't actually say that it's my faith that I'm reserved by. Did Jesus Christ not have faith? Hold your finger right here and go to Romans chapter 3. Verse 22. The righteousness of God, apart from the law, is manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. Even the righteousness of God, which is by faith of Jesus Christ, unto all and upon all them that believe, for there is no difference. I'll bet you, every time you read that verse, you always read it this way. Even the righteousness of God, which is by faith in Jesus Christ. And indeed, my footnote in my Schofield Reference Bible says in. Literally, it means in. Right? I believe there's a cross reference here. Let I think Galatians talks about the same thing. I once heard a hyper-Calvinist preach this passage. Same thing in Galatians chapter 2, verse 16. Knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ, even we have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified by the faith of Christ, and not by the works of the law, for by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. The point that is debatable here, the point that you should be open to seeing, is that it's Christ's faith that saves. It's not just the fact that I believe, I put my faith in Jesus Christ. It's the fact that Jesus Christ was a believer himself. That it was his faithfulness. Now, a capstone commentary on this. Are you with me here? This is kind of important, I think, anyway. It's that passage that I mentioned one time when we were going through 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 and following. It is a faithful saying, if we be dead with Christ, we shall also live with him. If we suffer, we shall also reign with him. If we deny him, he also will deny us. If we believe not, yet he abides faithful. He cannot deny himself. If we do not believe, what happens? If I stop believing, what happens? Christ remains faithful. I believe this gives me absolute confidence of eternal security, even in spite of the fact that I'm not faithful. Whenever I remain unfaithful, and I do 10 times a day, 20 times a day, some little thing I'll be unfaithful in. Does that jeopardize my security? Wait a sec. Jesus Christ remains faithful. How? 1 John chapter 2, it says that we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. And Jesus Christ remains absolutely committed as my intercessor and advocate in the presence of God. He is absolutely faithful even when I'm unfaithful. So is my security jeopardized? If I stop believing, every act of sin is an act of lack of faith. Right? It really is an act of unbelief. When I stop believing momentarily, Christ remains faithful. This passage does not teach that my faith jeopardizes my security. Right? It doesn't even say it's my faith in the first place, but that's the way they usually interpret it. So it all depends on my faith. What is it? Where are we here? 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 4. For you who are kept by the power of God through your faith unto salvation. Right? So that's the way they interpret it. God is working and you have to work, and if you give up, well then maybe you're not kept. That's the way they interpret the passage. It doesn't say that it's my faith. Why couldn't it be Christ's faith? I know that he remains faithful. See that? Does that make sense to you? There's another passage in 2 Peter chapter 1 that we'll turn to sometime, but we're done now. We're not going to go through all this verse by verse anyway, but to me, this has always been a wonderful passage of eternal security, and yet sometimes people will have a tendency to try to take away the blessing of a passage and make you doubt.